welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke, here to cover everything that went on in fantasy football today. We had a full slate of games, 4 straight hour blocks of games, started with an overtime game, ended with a game-winning field goal. So great day for football. Also nice to see a lot of players coming back from injuries, only a couple players suffering injuries that were unable to finish games, so a net positive this week in terms of the injury front. Definitely a lot of interesting things to go over, a lot at wide receiver, at least a little bit at running back. But before I get into it, I do want to mention I have expanded where I'm posting snap counts and articles and whatnot on social media, as well as posting on Twitter, which I've been doing for the past decade plus. I do have a Blue Sky account, which I've been posting to, Threads as well. The same content in all 3 places. So wherever you want to follow me for that kind of stuff, you're welcome to do any one of the 3 and you won't be missing out. First piece of takeaway that I want to go over is the Broncos backfield. Definitely interesting to see Audric Estime getting the majority of the carries this week. We had heard reports for multiple weeks that he might be getting more snaps, and then those kept on not materializing. A lot of times he would not play until late into the fourth quarter of games. So he really didn't have much of a role, and it was kind of the boy who cried wolf kind of thing. We kept hearing he might get more snaps, and then it kept on not happening. So we kept on thinking it might not happen anytime soon, but this week it happened in a big way. Ran the ball 14 times for 53 yards. Jaleel McLaughlin ran 2 times for 12 yards. Javonte Williams just 1 carry for 1 yard, also caught 2 passes. The one thing that makes me a little bit concerned is I'm not sure if Estime just kind of got that hot hand and that led him to get more carries. The first couple drives, he really wasn't involved in the offense. It wasn't until about drive 4 that he started seeing any playing time. So it wasn't necessarily the Broncos' plan to make him the lead running back on the first snap of the game. A lot of times when you see someone all of a sudden get double-digit carries, they're also starting the game. They're also doing it on the first drive, and that didn't happen this week. So while in terms of waiver wire, he's still going to be my top waiver wire running back, he's going to be the top one from the past couple weeks because there really hasn't been much change at running backs recently. There's at least a chance that he might not be the clear guy next week. Hopefully that's the case. He should at least be heavily involved in the rotation, but I'd probably want to see at least one more game before I'm really comfortable putting him in my fantasy starting lineups. But he did look decent in this game, even though it wasn't the most yards per carry. I was facing a team that has been relatively good against running backs this season. So good to see for him. Definitely not good to see if you've been a Williams fantasy manager. We had seen Williams playing time decrease each of the past couple weeks. It's been over a month now that his playing time's been slowly but steadily declining. So not great for Williams, but Broncos offense in general has been looking decent this season. So it'll be definitely interesting to see. I don't think there will be a lot of other running back situations where we see someone overtake the current starter unless there's an injury. So in terms of waiver wire running backs, he probably could be the best option over the rest of the season unless we start seeing more injuries at the position. The other 4 things that I want to cover today, all wide receiver situations. A lot of interesting things at wide receiver. Of course, we've had multiple trades recently, so a lot of teams gaining wide receiver, a lot of teams losing a wide receiver and adjusting because of that. But then some cases, it's just injuries that are impacting things. And starting off with the Indianapolis Colts, their wide receiver rotation throughout the last 2 years really has been fairly straightforward. It's been Alec Pierce as their X receiver, Michael Pittman as their Z receiver, and Josh Downs in the slot. And Michael Pittman has been on the injury report for a couple weeks now, fairly consistently not practicing to start the week, but then practicing a little bit later in the week, enough to play in the upcoming games. And that wasn't the case this week. Has been on the injury report with both a back and finger injury and was not able to play this week. Adonai Mitchell is someone, their second round wide receiver, who we thought would get more playing time in general this season, but he's been used in a lot of different ways so far this year. He was starting the season competing for that X role with Alec Pierce, and then once Josh Downs went down with injury in training camp, Mitchell moved to the slot, so he had already had to learn two different receiving roles, but Pittman's a different receiving role. So instead of Mitchell just stepping in and taking all of Pittman's snaps and the routes that he would run and lining up where Pittman would line up, it was Alec Pierce who switched positions. Pierce moved from that X receiver role to the Z receiver role, and then Mitchell took over as the X in this game. So all three receivers, it was fairly similar to what you would see once they were in those roles, but all three wide receivers had a very good game this week. Pierce caught 4 passes, 81 yards, and a touchdown. Down 7 receptions, 72 yards. Mitchell, 6 receptions, 71 yards. So all three over 70 receiving yards. It was the most Mitchell had 4 receptions specifically lined up on the outside on the line of scrimmage. That was the most for a Colts receiver in that role in a game this season. Pierce typically in that role typically makes a couple of big plays, but doesn't consistently make catches in that role, where Pierce was more consistently making catches at the Z receiver role, more so than what we've been seeing from Pittman this season. So because the wide receivers were doing so well, I wouldn't be surprised if they let Pittman rest a little bit longer, see how the wide receivers continue doing in these roles. And there's a chance that this might be a bit more of a rotation at wide receiver going forward, or I'm not sure exactly how the Colts will want to handle it, but I think Mitchell has played well enough given his opportunities this season that he deserves to be on the field more often. And then Pierce has also had the best season of his career and also deserves to remain on the field. And of course, Downs has been playing great basically every game this season, so he's not going anywhere either. Where Pittman has largely been disappointing this year, a couple big games, but still hasn't lived up to the expectations we've had for him. So hopefully going forward, we see some of these wide receivers to continue to step up, but I think it'll be interesting to see how they handle the situation going forward. Next wide receiver situation I want to cover is the San Francisco 49ers. They've been a team in flux at wide receiver for several weeks now, several guys either coming back from injury or suffering injuries and so on. But this was the first game that we saw Juwan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall active on the team at the same time. And I had been curious for a long time how they would handle those two both on the team, because they're both were expected to play a slot role on the team. But with Brandon Ayuk's injury, Ayuk typically the X receiver on the team. Jennings, instead of playing the slot this week, he took that X receiver role that Ayuk typically plays. Things weren't as black and white as they usually are with the 49ers receivers. They were moving guys around a bit, but it was still Ricky Pearsall mostly taking the slot role, mostly playing just in 11 personnel, where the other wide receivers were more every down receivers. The big difference for what could happen going forward is Chris Conley was out with injury. Conley had been playing the X receiver role in recent weeks with Brandon Ayuk out. So there's at least a chance once Conley is back, we could still see some kind of rotation at wide receiver. We could see Jennings move back to the slot. It's not exactly clear how they'll rotate their receivers, but we did see both players have good games this week. Jennings, 7 receptions for 93 yards. Pearsall, 4 receptions, 73 yards, and a touchdown. Also, just generally good to see only 5 players on the team had targets. Christian McCaffrey, who basically went back to the role that he had last season in his first game back, which was good to see. The top 3 wide receivers and Kittle. So even though it's hard for 49ers players for fantasy purposes in general, because there's so many good options, the fact that they're consolidated to just these 5 players does make it a little easier for all of the guys to have at least a decent game each week. Next wide receiver situation I want to cover is the Carolina Panthers, the team that played this morning and got a victory. We got to see Jalen Coker have a much larger role this week than we've seen in past weeks. The team traded Deontay Johnson to the Ravens a couple weeks ago, and then this past week it was Jonathan Mingo that they traded to the Dallas Cowboys. And last week we saw Mingo and Jalen kind of rotate in that slot role for Carolina, but with one fewer wide receiver on the team, we saw a lot less rotation at the wide receiver position than really what we've seen the past 2 years. It was just Xavier Legette and David Moore as the outside receivers and Jalen playing in the slot. So that was good to see. Jalen 8 targets in the game, which was great. He only caught 3 passes for 41 yards. So ideally, he would have caught a few more of those passes. Legette, still the top outside receiver on the team, had 4 targets, brought in 3 passes for 40 yards. David Moore, 2 receptions, 18 yards. Not the best game for the Panthers in terms of passing and getting a lot of receiving yards. Hubbard had his best game of his career, basically, in terms of running the ball. So that meant the Panthers didn't need to pass the ball an awful lot in this game. The Panthers do have a lot of favorable matchups over the rest of the year, which is good to see. The only concern is Adam Thielen is back on, or should be back fairly shortly for the Panthers. It could be as early as 2 weeks from now. They have their bye week next week. So it'll be very interesting to see how they handle the wide receiver rotation once Thielen is back. Thielen has typically for Carolina played in a slot, which is not good for Jalen, but he also has plenty of experience as an outside receiver. Back in his days with the Minnesota Vikings, he was fairly consistently on the outside throughout his career there. So I think ideally for fantasy, he just takes David Moore's spot in the lineup, allowing the 2 rookie wide receivers to continue to see a lot of playing time with Adam Thielen also on the field. But definitely a chance that Jalen sees a significant decrease in playing time with Thielen back, or it could be some crazy rotation. So that'll be interesting to see. And then the last situation I want to cover is the Buffalo Bills, where they were down 2 of their top receivers this week. Keon Coleman was out as expected, and then Amari Cooper, it became pretty clear on Saturday that he was not going to play. Anytime a team signs one wide receiver from the practice squad to their 53-man roster and then call up 2 more players from the practice squad just for the week, usually not a great sign for the injured players. So that ended up being the case. Amari Cooper was also inactive. So we generally saw a lot less rotation at wide receiver than we typically see from the Bills, but it wasn't Khalil Shakir who saw a significant increase in playing time. It was Curtis Samuel who ended up playing on the outside a lot, both in 11 personnel and 12 personnel, was just constantly on the field for Buffalo in a role that I kind of thought he would have at the beginning of the season. I thought it would be Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel on the outside, Shakir in the slot, and Mac Hollins maybe rotating in a little bit, but that isn't what we've seen all season. We've seen Mac Hollins as a starter the entire season. And Samuel in that role had 8 targets in the game. Only brought in 4 passes for 35 yards, but he saw a ton of targets, which hasn't necessarily always happened to the outside receivers, where Khalil Shakir has consistently played in 11 personnel, only playing in roughly 20% of 12 personnel snaps all season long. Saw a slight increase this week, but it wasn't overly significant. He did see more snaps in 11 personnel because typically Samuel is the backup there, and now with Samuel playing on the outside, Shakir had no one to rotate with, so that's been good to see. And he has been consistently seeing yards all season long despite playing in a part-time role. Caught 6 passes for 58 yards this week and has very consistently been getting at least 40 yards. So definitely good to see by the Buffalo receivers. I would like to see Samuel continue to play more on the outside, but I think once Keon Coleman and Amari Cooper are both back, we probably will go back to seeing not much of Samuel. So that covers it for the 5 things I wanted to go through. I do have 2 questions in the chat that I will try to answer, but first I have to read over them fully. The first one, should I trade CD and Dobbins for Connor, Hawkinson, and Ridley? Off the top of my head, I think that would be an okay trade to make. It's with Lamb, I would hope with Trey Lance he would start having more value than he had in this game. And J.K. Dobbins, it is a bit concerning. Gus Edwards back this week. Edwards played his best game of the season with Los Angeles and could see more carries going forward. A lot of matchups upcoming where they're going to have to throw the ball a lot and not run the ball so much. So Ridley, I think, should have a decent rest of the season. James Conner has largely been playing well, and the Cardinals have a fairly good schedule. Hawkinson didn't see too much of an increase in playing time this week, but looking at your roster, definitely some concerns at tight end. Evan Ingram has a very tough schedule. Pitts has been rotated out a lot. I think I would be okay making that trade. And then the other question I had, 10-team league. Lots of players on the team. Should I trade Chase Brown, Sam Laporta, and Marvin Harrison Jr. for Trey McBride and Mike Evans? I probably would not make that trade. I think Evans should hopefully be back fairly soon. I believe they have their bye week recently. If I'm remembering off the top of my head right, I might not be. But Chase Brown, I like him a lot for how well he's been playing. Sam Laporta just had an injury. Obviously want to see what the extent of that injury is. But Trey McBride, I've been very happy with him at tight end. It probably depends on the Laporta injury, but I think if Laporta ends up being a long-term injury, you might not be able to make that trade anymore. So I think a lot depends on that. And then just how to treat CeeDee Lamb going forward. I think you have to keep him in your starting lineup. I would hope that Trey Lance is the starting quarterback going forward, and we can start to see what he does there. And then I would think Lamb would have more fantasy value with him rather than Cooper Rush. Even if Rush remains a quarterback, he has to play better than he did this game. We've seen him play better earlier in his career. So I'm holding on to Lamb. I'm probably starting him. A lot will depend on the other wide receivers on the roster. Also asking about Javonte Williams and Jalen Millen. Williams, I would be comfortable dropping him in a decent number of leagues. Like I said at the start, I wouldn't be surprised if the Broncos were treating this game as a hot hand and maybe Williams continues to get the start. So maybe hold on to him for another week, but I would not be having him in my starting lineup. And McMillan, this week he was on the injury report. He was on the active roster, did not see a snap on offense this week. So that was pretty concerning, but I would not be surprised if he goes back to having a large role once he's healthy again. Would ideally hold on to him for another week, but I think there are some intriguing wide receiver options off the waiver wire. So if there is someone you like better, I also wouldn't mind dropping him. He is not someone that I'm including in the waiver wire article this week just because there are a number of options that I find intriguing. So I think that'll pretty much cover it for me. Like I said at the start of the show, on social media, you can find me not just on Twitter now, but on Threads and Blue Sky as well. Also, if you want to find more information about any of the games that happened today, definitely check out my recap article where I covered all 12 games that happened and at least one significant thing in every game and for every team. Also, if you want more information about snaps in general, if you want to find out how well the players played, not just the utilization for the players, definitely go ahead and get a PFF Plus subscription so you can look at our premium stats, which has this information not just for this week, but for past weeks as well. And on days like today, where it's Sunday and I'm focusing more on the recap articles and the waiver article and not so much tweeting snap counts, we are keeping track of this data live this year in Premium Stats, so you are able to follow along and see how the snaps are progressing for any of the games that you want in our Premium Stats section. So definitely check that out if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription already. That's also how you get access to my fantasy rankings, which are some of the most accurate rankings in the industry, as well as a lot of my articles that aren't the recap articles, including the waiver wire article, rest of season rankings, start sit article. And this week will be pretty normal, but we will start to slowly but surely wind things down since next week, for a lot of leagues, is the trade deadline. It's the last week to make trades. So this upcoming 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high will be the last version of that article this season. Should be back next season. I fully expect it to. But with the trade deadlines coming up in a lot of fantasy leagues, there will no longer be the option to buy low or sell high. So definitely, if you want to make moves in your league, definitely check out when the trade deadline is to be sure. There will be some leagues that do extend farther beyond this upcoming week, but definitely know that beforehand so you know when you have to make the trades by. But we'll have that article up as usual on Tuesday this week, as well as the usual podcast schedule. John will have his IDP episode up in the morning, as well as his other IDP episode later this week. I will have the waiver podcast on Tuesday with John as usual, and definitely some different names this week, some interesting names at all 4 positions. So a good week for waivers, especially compared to the past 2 weeks where it seemed like it was a lot of the same guys and a lot of players who weren't necessarily stepping up and earning a spot in the waiver article. So hopefully you had a good week 10. We're already halfway through the season. Hopefully you are getting to a point where you're clinching playoff spots and are fighting for first round buys and whatnot. And hopefully if you need stuff for Monday Night Football, I know I still have a couple close matchups. Hopefully you get what you need in that game. So with that, peace out.